It's a great pleasure to be associated with this very important event. So let me again welcome all of you. Both our countries, Malaysia and Australia, are living under the shadow of COVID-19. Freedom, the question of freedom has been up in the air, whether we have lost some of our freedoms and whether we might get them back. We've had some pleasant news this morning that some restrictions will be eased, but a long way to go. So that's the world of pandemic for the moment. But freedom, of course, is a very important question, and it has many important aspects to it than the implications of the pandemic. We've seen time and again, haven't we, freedom being at the heart of one conflict after another. We saw it in the wars of independence, which brought the colonial era to an end, whether it be Africa, India, and of course, the long struggle that took place in Vietnam, which resulted in the eventual withdrawal of the United States. So freedom is, for obvious reasons, a contentious question. It has its ugly side when it leads to injustice and conflict. It gives rise, when people want to fight the freedom of others, to narrow interests, passions, and prejudice. They easily come to the surface. So today we are dealing with one such area of conflict, which has to do with Palestine and indeed the wider Middle East. It's a contentious issue, we know that. And today, in line with Pax Christi's philosophy, we're going to consider it, the question of freedom for Palestine, but we're going to try and do it in a spirit of dialogue. Mutual respect for different views and respect for different communities, peoples, and of course, faith traditions. And when we speak of faith traditions, of course, particularly when we have Israel-Palestine in mind and of the wider Middle East, we are thinking of three Abrahamic faiths, each of which, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have made an immense contribution over the centuries. To some extent, they still do. Yet it's also the case that they have much to answer for. They have, in practice, the adherents of these three great traditions have not always lived up to the wisdom of their prophets, their sages, or their founders. So much is at stake when we look at this question. It's so much bigger than the tiny countries that we're dealing with in one part of the world, so many thousands of miles away from us. Before I invite our speaker, just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to, in the spirit of dialogue, have an important session after Dr. Chandra has spoken, with some quite a bit of time for Q&A. Please keep your questions short. That makes it so much easier to handle them and to put them into some kind of logical order. And for that purpose, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please try to keep them short and not too many of them from any one person, otherwise very difficult to handle. And of course, courteous and polite, regardless of where we're coming from at all times. Well, now it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, whom I have known for a very long time. I think it's probably at least 40 years. And during that time, I have come to appreciate what is a man of immense intellect, of passionate engagement with the great issues of our time, and of commitment to so many causes. He is, of course, the president of the International Movement for a Just World, has been for many years. And you can see the website homepage of JUST, for short, on your screen. Lots of fascinating material. I would encourage anyone to have a little browse when you have a moment. And of course, Dr. Chandra has held important positions at Malaysian universities. He has visited many others, engaged in innumerable conferences and hosted many of them, convened several of them, and many, at least a few, in conjunction with Pax Christi. And we greatly appreciate that long-standing relationship. And of course, is the author of many books, including 3 that you see on your screen that have some bearing on the question of Palestine, and 3 other books that both of us, Dr. Chandra and myself, have had the pleasure to be involved with in some collaborative way, are the ones that I have edited or ones that Dr. Chandra has edited. The last thing I should say about him, of course, is that he's a very important voice in his own country, in Malaysia, which, like most countries, has its ups and downs. He's a highly respected voice through difficult times, times of instability. He has been a reassuring voice, and a voice that always points forward to a better future for his country. And the same, I think, holds in a different sense for other parts of Asia and beyond. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Chandra Muzaffar to address us on the question of Palestine. Do we have a turning point? Dr. Chandra.
Thank you, Joe. Peace be with you. It is such a pleasure to participate in this dialogue. I've always enjoyed immensely the opportunities to interact with Pax Christi. I've learned a great deal in the process, and I hope that this will be another such occasion. Friends, before I attempt to show why Palestine may be at a turning point, let me underscore the significance of the Palestinian issue to the world. Why is Palestine so important to the world, as it has been for quite a long while? There are many reasons why Palestine is important. I shall highlight a few of them. First, it is the human suffering associated with the Palestinian struggle. There have been wars, as we all know, 48, 67, and the assaults on Gaza a number of times since 2008. A lot of people have been killed, thousands have been killed, mainly Palestinians, but also Israelis who have died in this conflict. It's also true that people have been imprisoned, tortured, and perhaps most of all, in terms of the Palestinian struggle, a lot of people have been expelled from their homeland. Over a period of time, thousands have been expelled, beginning with what happened in 1948 whole villages, whole communities. People lost their homes. And this, I think, is perhaps yet another reason why Palestine is so important. It's not just human suffering, it is the injustice linked to that suffering. And it is injustice that is inextricably intertwined with the question of dispossession. Dispossession carries with it a certain meaning. When people are dispossessed, when they lose their land, their home, when they lose their identity in some instances, you will find that the injustice is so much more painful. And that is what has happened to the Palestinian people. They are a victim of a long-standing injustice related to dispossession. And that dispossession, if one wants to understand it in greater depth, is part and parcel of what some of us would describe as settler colonialism. Those who came from outside, and here we are referring to Jews, Zionists from Europe, Eastern Europe, other parts of Europe, who came and occupied Palestine. We have to distinguish these people who came from outside from the Jews who had always been part of Palestine and that region. That had never been an issue, actually, for the Palestinians. They'd lived together for a long while. So it is basically Israel's position as a settler colony, which is at the root of this injustice, settler colonization, which we have seen in other parts of the world, different forms, different expressions. We're talking of the Americas, we are talking of Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the world where we've had this sort of colonization, settler colonization. And you will realize in a while why it is so different in the case of Palestine in relation to Israel and why it has had certain ramifications. So this is at the heart of the injustice, the problem of settler colonization. And it is linked to perhaps yet another dimension of this conflict that is very important for us to keep in mind. If it was just settler colonization, it was just occupation, it would have, of course, generated a great deal of anguish and angst amongst the victims. We know that. It's happened over and over again in history. But there is another dimension which has made it worse. The colonizer, if you like, the occupier, and the occupied, there is a tremendous difference in their exercise of power. And this makes the situation worse. The occupier is so much more powerful than the occupied, which is why the occupation itself, this whole question of the marginalization of the Palestinians, their expulsion and their suffering, takes on a deeper meaning because of this asymmetry, this tremendous disparity in terms of power. The power that Israel wields and the situation of the Palestinians, who are so much weaker. And we must also look at yet another dimension of this conflict, why it is so important to the world. We cannot deny that the Palestinian conflict since 1948 has impacted upon almost every country in the region. In fact, the conflicts that have taken place since 48 in West Asia, and I use the term West Asia, not the Middle East, because I think it is more appropriate as a term, as a description of the region we are talking about. Now, this conflict, the Palestinian conflict in West Asia, it has had very serious implications for Lebanon, for Iraq, for Syria, for Libya, and even for Yemen. They are all linked directly or indirectly to Palestine in one way or another, which is why there can be no peace in West Asia without a resolution of the Palestinian conflict, or the conflict between Palestine and Israel. This is at the heart of the instability, the turmoil, the tumult in that part of the world. And that part of the world is so important to the whole of humankind. This is the only region in the world where three continents meet. It has vital waterways, vital routes. It has oil, which remains a major resource. It is a region where you have the three Abrahamic faiths, but also other religions. It is a very complex region. It is a region which is, in a sense, the fulcrum of the world as we know it today. And this is the reason why we cannot talk about peace, we cannot talk about security, we cannot talk about restoring the dignity of human beings without addressing this fundamental challenge, the challenge of the conflict between Israel, Palestine, and the Arabs. It is for this reason, dear friends, that Nelson Mandela once described the conflict, the Palestinian conflict, as the greatest moral issue of our time. So this is also the reason why I think we have to be brave enough to find solutions, to work towards the resolution of this conflict. Though we know that for the last 70 odd years, people have been talking about resolving the conflict, but we've got nowhere. And that itself is a reflection of the dynamics of this conflict, of how difficult it is to overcome this conflict. So that's the backdrop, friends. Palestine, why it's important to the world. Because of its impact, if I may try to sum it up in a nutshell, because of its impact upon all the other countries in the region, wars, conflicts, because of how important this conflict is in terms of the larger dimensions of global politics. It is, as we know, linked to hegemony, to that region of the world, to oil, to human suffering, which we sometimes tend to forget, is perhaps the key factor one should always keep in mind whenever we talk about conflicts, whether domestic or international. Let me, with this as the back, try to look at Palestine as a turning point. Why is Palestine at a turning point today? There are many reasons. I want to begin with the so-called deal of the century, which brings a certain dimension into this long-standing conflict. I don't subscribe to the idea that it's the deal of the century. It is a deal which is a reflection of the forces that have been at work in that region for quite a long while. So you have this deal. A number of actors have been involved in this. Of course, Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had played an important role. And some of the others, of course, Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. Maybe the others were less important, the other players. Some lurking in the background and so on, but they were all part of the so-called deal of the century. Now, what the deal of the century has done, and this is its significance, friends, it has tried to depoliticize the conflict, to change, to transform the conflict from a political conflict linked to very fundamental issues like the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, millions of them, the whole question of dispossession, the question of human rights of the dispossessed. The deal has sought to set aside these issues and just focus on the economic dimension, and that too in a very superficial way. In other words, an attempt to put it crudely, to buy up the Palestinians who are suffering, to create some jobs, to provide some openings for the livelihood of the thousands and thousands who are unemployed or underemployed in that part of the world. And the hope that the deal makers have is this, that if you can perhaps just focus on the economy, you'll be able to solve the problem. And after a while, the Palestinians would forget about the right of return, they would forget about the dispossession, they would forget about the whole history of the conflict and be happy with the jobs they have and the sort of money that they would be earning from what the deal makers hope would be a different sort of economy for the Palestinians. We're not sure whether that'll happen. We know from the response of ordinary Palestinians and Arabs that they don't buy this. The elites, at least some of the elites, they may go along with this, but not ordinary Palestinians who have resisted this deal, who have been very critical and who have made it very clear, in no uncertain terms, that they do not see this as the solution to their suffering. And this, in fact, brings me to the second dimension of the situation that confronts us today, why Palestine has become a turning point. There is resistance, which is not highlighted in the mainstream media, to the deal. At the level of ordinary people, there have been eruptions here and there is a lot of resentment, a lot of anger with the elites. But because of the nature of many of these regimes, they're authoritarian, they're brutal, you find that ordinary people are not able to organize and express themselves, though there have been some attempts in that direction. Now, what the deal has also done, and this is important in terms of resistance, it has sharpened the role of Iran in that region. It has given a certain meaning to the role of Iran as the champion of the Palestinian cause. And as a recent study showed, that amongst Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, the standing of Iran and leaders of Iran who are seen as championing the Palestinian cause has gone up tremendously as a result of this reaction to the deal that the United States of America and Israel has tried to impose upon the Palestinian people. So this is yet another reason why it is so important to look at Palestine at this point, why it is a turning point, the resistance, and the role of Iran, and what this could lead to. This is the other point that I want to make. What could this lead to? Because, you know, there has been a dichotomy within the Muslim world for a very long while, for hundreds of years. This is the Sunni-Shia dichotomy. Iran is largely Shia, which is a minority sect within the Muslim world. About perhaps 15 to 20% of Muslims worldwide are Shia. The vast majority are Sunni. And because Iran is preponderantly Shia, Iraq is about 60% Shia. Bahrain, the majority of the population is also Shia. So there are some of these Shia majority countries, and they do have an impact upon the larger landscape, especially Iran. The Sunni-Shia conflict, I think, will take on a more sophisticated and complicated meaning as a result of the deal. Given the role of Iran and given the role of Iraq, don't forget that Iraq has, as I said a while ago, a Shia majority, and its link with Iran, which is not just political, it is a very deep spiritual link, because some of the most important religious sites for the Shias are actually in Iraq. And so Iraq will be very, very important as far as this conflict is concerned, especially with this Sunni-Shia dichotomy. And now with the Shia seen as championing the Palestinian cause and some of the Sunni elite, and I want to emphasize this, Sunni elite, not the people, the Sunni elite seen as working with Israel, working with other countries that may be part of the deal. We know two countries that have forged diplomatic ties with Israel in recent months, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Their leaders are Sunni, and this, I think, is going to make the situation even more complicated. So you have the leaders playing this role, and of course there is Saudi Arabia in the background, very important. There is no way Bahrain and United Arab Emirates would have forged diplomatic ties with Israel without the green light from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a very important place within the Muslim world because of Mecca and Medina, the two holy cities for Muslims, most holy cities of Muslims. They're both in Saudi Arabia. And if the Saudis are seen as leaning more and more towards Israel, then I think it is going to make the situation even more dangerous in the region. Why do I say it'll be even more dangerous? Because I think the resentment and the anger directed against the Saudis will increase. And it has been increasing over the last few years. The feeling that the Saudis have betrayed Muslims, have betrayed the Palestinians and so on, I think that sort of sentiment will get stronger and stronger. And what it will lead to, we don't know. But this dimension is also going to become very important. So you have, if I may say this, friends, a sort of realignment taking place, which is a realignment that has a historical root, in a sense, Sunni Shia, but at the same time, it has become more complicated because you have Sunni peoples aligning with Shia governments to some extent, and a certain alienation of and isolation of very important Sunni regimes like Saudi Arabia as a result of the deal and its consequences. Yet another dimension, friends, which has also complicated the situation. Now, in the last few years, since 2015 in particular, but even before that, other actors from outside the region have become very important in the whole of West Asia. And willy-nilly, it's connected with Palestine. Though the issue is not just Palestine, it's Syria, it is the attempt to control Syria, and through Syria, the Hezbollah, and also to exercise influence of Iran and so on, which I think is at the root of the long conflict in Syria for quite a long while. You know, this has been happening. And what we are now witnessing is a situation where the role of Syria, which is not a Shia majority country, in fact, it's Sunni majority, clear Sunni majority. The leadership is a sect of the Shia community, a small sect. That's the leadership, though the Sunni-Shia dichotomy has never really been important in Syria. But that is also begun to emerge very strongly. And the point I wanted to make was it is linked to the role of actors from outside the region. Russia, always close to the government in Damascus, and that has been so since the early 70s, actually. The father of the present president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, his father, Hafiz al-Assad, was already close to the Soviet Union, had forged ties with the Soviet Union and so on, and this has continued. Now Russia has become even more involved in Syria, more involved in the politics of that region, and Russia was a decisive factor in changing the political equation in Syria. It is because of Russian involvement that the Syrian government was able to sustain itself. So there is Syria, and there is Russia now, an actor, very important actor in the region. Involved not just in Syria now, even in the other issues, Russia is involved directly or indirectly. Sometimes it's just diplomacy. There is also China, more involved in that region than it ever was before, and continuing to play a role, partly because of oil, but also because of geopolitics. Other actors have become important. And I should add Turkey. Turkey has also become important in the region. Turkey became important during the Arab uprisings because of the support it gave to some of those uprisings, and it has continued to exert its influence in that region. So what all this is going to lead to, we really don't know, but there is Turkey, there is China, there is Russia, the other forces that have become part of the region. It is part of the change that is taking place in West Asia and in the world. And that change, friends, assumes a certain significance beyond what we can imagine at this moment because of the decline of the United States of America. These new actors that have emerged, the roles they're playing, the United States is certainly declining in that region. And it was very clear in the conflict in Syria that the United States is no longer the force it once was. And also, if you look at Yemen, you can see why the US role has, in a sense, weakened the American position, because Yemen is a terrible tragedy, and the US has chosen to align itself with those who are responsible for that tragedy. And its standing in the whole region has been affected as a result of the role it has played. So you have the US, protector, guardian of Israel for a long while, caught in this quagmire, a situation that is changing quite rapidly, declining, other forces coming up, How will it impact upon Israel's own position? How will it impact upon the Palestinian issue? We really don't know. So this is something we should keep in mind. And this is why I regard Palestine at this point in time as very, very vital. It is at a turning point because it's linked, as you can see, to the larger politics of not just the region, but the world. And we have to be alert to this. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation. What do we do in a situation like this, all of us? Pax Christi, very important organization, just a number of other organizations. What do we do in a situation like this? I think the first task is to increase people's awareness, make them aware of the complexity of the situation, how things are changing, what the historical background is. I think that is very, very vital. Increasing awareness of what is happening because it is a very, very complicated part of the world. Number two, I've for a long while advocated translating good materials written by people from different backgrounds, not just Palestinians or Arabs, but a lot of other people, and especially quite a lot of people from the United States of America and Europe who have written about this region and its conflict. But most of these writings are in English. I think these writings have to be translated to other languages so that people know what is happening. There isn't much literature on Palestine and the conflict and the larger dimensions of West Asia and so on in Korean, for instance, or in Japanese or Chinese. I've checked with different people and they tell me that there is a tremendous paucity of materials. So I think there is a need to translate, to make people aware what is really happening. And this, I think, would contribute towards us working towards solutions that are real, that are feasible. We should also set up more support groups to champion the cause of the Palestinians. Support groups which do exist in various parts of the world, but they are weak and they're not very active. We should do more to strengthen these support groups. And that, I think, will make an impact over a period of time. I know that support groups for the anti-apartheid forces in South Africa, they played a role. I don't see the groups in Palestine and those who support Palestine having the same sort of impact at this moment. So more support groups, and I think it's so important for us also to link up with the BDS movement, because that's the one movement at the level of civil society which has had a tremendous impact. It's stronger in Europe than in many other parts of the world, but it is something which is making waves. And it is important for the boycott, divest, sanctions movement to succeed. And I think these groups, which I hope will emerge, Palestinian groups, groups on West Asia, they'll be able to work together. And we should monitor the global situation, because I see the ultimate solution to the Palestinian issue from a global perspective. When the global situation changes, with the other forces that emerge, when there's greater equity and fairness in the global system, when there is less hegemony and perhaps a world order that gives some role to smaller nation states and other actors, not just the United States, which will always be there as an important actor, but other actors, when they're able to play their role, then I think the global system itself will be able to find a solution for the Palestinian struggle. At the moment, the UN has not been able to play this role because it's dominated by the US. But in a more equitable global order, it is quite possible, it's conceivable that some of these institutions at the global level will be able to contribute towards a solution to the Palestinian struggle. And I want to end by saying that in the midst of all this, we analyze, we talk about the different dimensions of a conflict like this. In the midst of all this, I would once again want to pay tribute to the Palestinian people. They have suffered a great deal, they have resisted, they have stood up, which is remarkable. There are very few people in history who have shown the sort of commitment that the Palestinian people have. And there are, of course, elements which we were not happy about, and I continue to be unhappy about this, and I continue to speak about this. I do not think that in their struggle, their just struggle, Palestinians should ever resort to senseless violence, to acts of terror, because that undermines their struggle. That's very, very important to remember. And there's yet another weakness within the Palestinian struggle. Though we commend and we laud their commitment, I think it is a pity. I want to use stronger words, but I think it is a pity that for a liberation struggle, compared to other liberation struggles, the divisions that exist amongst the Palestinians, it is a matter of great regret. Between the Hamas and Fatah, for instance, you cannot have a liberation struggle that is so divided. And that, I think, is one of the major weaknesses. These are challenges that the Palestinians themselves must address. One hopes that the Palestinian diaspora, and some of them are in Australia, they'll all be able to help the Palestinians to overcome challenges of this sort, choose the right methods, be committed to peaceful change, and at the same time, work together within one's noble struggle for justice, work together. I think that is very, very important. And for all of us who are supporters of, sympathizers of the struggle, what we would like to see is the struggle should succeed. And we hope that its success will mean a lot to the world. We go back to what Joe had also mentioned in his introductory remarks, the Abrahamic faiths. Maybe success should also mean the ability of the followers of these three faiths to work together in greater harmony for the future. At the moment, as some of us are aware, the relationship forged between Palestinian Muslims and Christians is something which is heartwarming. It is a strong relationship. You can see it in the global Kairos movement and in other movements. They work closely together. But the Jews and ancient people who have been part of that region, they should also be part of this struggle for justice. And there are Jews who are committed to this struggle too. One hopes that this is the crucible, West Asia, that will bring together these three great faiths for a future for the whole of humankind, which we have not witnessed yet. But maybe the key lies in that one region of the world where, as someone once put it, God had touched 3 times. Maybe it had some meaning, that divine touch for West Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chandra. So much food for thought, so many issues to consider. What I propose to do now is to just have a brief chat with you around a couple of questions and then open it up to everyone else. I see that some of the questions, in fact, touch on one of the 2 issues I'd like to raise with you. if we're now thinking in terms of support for the Palestinian cause, we could think first of the Arab world, secondly of the wider Muslim world, Islamic world, and thirdly at parts of the Western world. No doubt there are other areas too, but that's three big ones to consider. At the present moment, given all the complications you've mentioned, where do you see fertile ground for increasing support, active support for the Palestinian cause, either amongst governments or amongst the citizenry of in these three big regions or big areas, sectors of the world? How do you see the prospects of a greater striving to become aware of and then respond to the challenges that you've been describing around Palestine?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. This is an important question. If you look at the present situation in terms of support for the BDS movement, for instance.
Chandra, if I may interrupt you, someone asked the question, what is the BDS?
Okay. Well, it stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanctions. And it is a movement that began in Palestine itself, started by some of their activists and intellectuals. And what it does is to urge groups, countries, most of all corporations, to boycott, in some instances, Palestinian boycott Israeli firms, boycott Israeli enterprises which have investments in the West Bank, which are seen as supporting the occupation, the post-67 occupation. So it is either boycotts or sometimes cutting off ties or lessening, reducing ties. Universities have also been involved. Universities have been drawn into this movement, and also activities, cultural activities. Sometimes it may be a concert, which some people in the West, for instance, may want to organize a concert in Israel. And the BDS movement will try to dissuade them and say that you're just supporting occupation if you don't take a stand against this, or at least send a certain message to the organizers on the Israeli side. So it takes on forms of this sort. And it has been successful because I think there have been more and more people supporting this type of movement, including some Hollywood celebrities and people from other parts of the world.
I interrupted you midstream. Yeah. Sorry about that. We're talking about potential areas of support.
Yeah, well, given what has been happening, BDS, it is certainly Europe. Western Europe that has been more supportive of BDS than maybe any other part of the world. In the United States, the last 5 years or so, it has also been growing, support for BDS. Some of us would have seen how students and staff at Harvard, how they responded to the Israeli ambassador, some months ago, maybe perhaps more than a year ago. And their response was an indication of how they felt about Israel's position. I mean, it just widely circulated, that particular video. Of course, these things are not highlighted in the mainstream media, whether online or offline, but I think people know about this, and these things give you an idea of how this movement is growing. So if you look at the BDS movement and popular support for some of its goals, I see Europe, to a lesser extent the United States, as fertile areas compared to some other areas. There isn't much of a BDS movement in parts of Asia. You have to understand this. You don't have it in India, for instance. Maybe India 30 years ago would have been different, but not in India today. And you don't have this sort of thing in China or in other parts of Asia. But I think in Europe, in North America, there is some hope.
And Chandra, people might be interested. The Muslim world in this part of the world, meaning Asia Pacific, but Malaysia, primarily Muslim country, Indonesia, large Muslim minority in India, and of course Pakistan and so on. Do you detect much interest or awareness on the part of either governments or the electorate in the whole question that we've been discussing today?
Another good question, Joe. I think at the level of ordinary people, there's always been overwhelming support for Palestine in all the Muslim majority countries. Overwhelming support, by which I mean that it is a cause to which they are committed. And it is, I think, partly the religious tie, if you like, why they feel this way about the Palestinian cause. And there would be the usual expressions of support, when something happens, like the case of the flotilla that was attempting to go to Israel, and the actions taken by the Israeli government and how people reacted to that. So things of that sort, suddenly something happens, an eruption takes place, there would be a reaction. That's at the level of people. Governments, I think governments tend to reflect this to some extent, but they're very careful at the same time, because for many of them, I think it is the global situation and the role of the United States of America. They're close to the United States. They don't want to be seen as antagonizing the United States, They would go for countries like Indonesia, Malaysia to some extent, even Pakistan, though, there have been changes in recent months. But nonetheless, I think it is the US as the protector of Israel. For that reason, they become quite cautious about taking too strong a stand. But nonetheless, when it comes to a UN vote, or when it comes to doing some of the things that are minimal, they would be prepared to do it, the governments.
Chandra, let's now take some more questions from we've got probably about 150 people listening to what you have to say, and some questions. One of them arises from what you've just been saying, and it comes from Ismail Al-Barak. Basically, he's pointing to the hypocrisy of a number of Arab and perhaps even Muslim leaders in different parts of the world who preach support for the Palestinian cause, but in practice do very little and sometimes even act in ways that are detrimental to it. What do you make of this hypocrisy? And the second part of the question, how do Palestinian leaders react to this hypocrisy, be it Hamas or be it the leadership in the West Bank? Are they prepared to expose it, if you like, or are they too weak to be able to do that?
I'll begin with the latter part of the question. I think they are not prepared to expose it. They are very much aware of this hypocrisy. But leaders, whether they're from Hamas or from Fatah, I don't think they will take a strong stand, because they need the support of these countries, of these leaders. And so what they will do is, I suppose, maintain a certain external politeness when they meet them, when they interact with them and so on. among themselves and within their own groups, I suppose they would express their feelings about this sort of hypocrisy. And they may even, through other channels, perhaps, some of the civil society groups and groups which are not part of government as such, or don't have to deal with authority, they would perhaps take very strong positions. But on the outside, it is a sort of politeness when one deals with them. The larger question that our friend had asked, it's about hypocrisy as such. It is rampant. It is rife all over the Muslim world, but also other communities. It's not confined, to Muslims. There is this hypocrisy in our global system. It's so much a part of, well, not just the global system, in domestic politics everywhere. There is this sort of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy is related to two factors, it seems to me, perhaps three. But the most obvious to me, and perhaps the one most obvious factor, would of course be power. You're hypocritical because of the reality of power. You don't want to be seen as taking a certain position because you feel it may affect your own position. It may hurt your own interests. And because those who are taking a certain position, they're very powerful, you tend to adjust your behavior to their power. It's happened for a very, very long while. And the other reason could be wealth. You're hypocritical because, let's say, if one of the countries that behaves in this way, that is hypocritical, putting on a show when they're not sincere, they also give you a lot of money at the same time. Let's say they give you a lot of money. I'm just talking about a hypothetical situation, but I'm sure people can draw their own conclusions, yeah? You provide money, but you are at the same time working closely with the enemy, right? So what do? You need the money. You take the money and you put up with that sort of behavior. And the other reason, the third reason, apart from power and wealth, I think hypocrisy is perhaps more deeply ingrained in certain cultures than others. And that may be a product of historical evolution. Societies which have been weak, communities that have been weak, that have had to live within a certain environment, I suppose after a while, that hypocrisy becomes almost second nature to you. And because you are in that sort of situation, I'm thinking, Joe, you and I, we have worked on these issues before. I'm thinking of situations, multi-ethnic societies where minorities sometimes have to be very cognizant of the power of the majority community, and so they adjust, And so they become hypocritical in a sense, because they're confronted with hypocrisy, they also become hypocritical. And this is going on in many examples,
Chanda, there are a few questions amongst the participants in today's forum on some more on regional aspects. Would you care to say a little bit more about how events, particularly recent events, are affecting countries like Jordan and Lebanon? And perhaps one questioner asks, what about India-Israel links? Are they also weakening the Palestinian position?
Yeah, these are important questions too, Joe, about Jordan and Lebanon. Lebanon, almost every major development in Lebanon for the last so many decades has been linked to the Palestinian issue or to Israel and to Israel's power. And that continues to express itself. I mean, if you look at what had happened in Beirut and the reactions of various groups and what may be the real story behind Beirut, we don't know yet, I think it is something that you can't extricate completely from the Palestine-Israel conflict. For Israel, we can't go into details at this stage here, but I think for Israel, Lebanon is seen as strategically vital. The Litani River, people from that part of the world would know this, that this river in Lebanon, according to certain Israeli sources, is critical to Israel's security, its well-being, perhaps as critical, perhaps even more critical than the Golan Heights in Syria, Litani River in Lebanon, which is why they've always wanted to control these two. They had attempted to control the Litani River a number of times, but they'd failed. And of course, Hezbollah has been a major factor in sort of thwarting Israeli plans as far as Lebanon is concerned. And for the Lebanese, Hezbollah in particular, but also other forces in Lebanon, this would be a very important consideration. The whole question of sovereignty and their independence is tied to what Israel wants to do or wants to achieve and what they want to accomplish and how they see the Palestinian struggle, because that impacts upon Lebanon. Jordan, a bit different in some respects, but nonetheless, I think Jordan is also very critical in terms of strategic interests, which is why the Jordan Valley has always figured in any attempt to achieve some sort of settlement. And it will continue to be very, very important for that reason, How it will unfold in the future, we don't know, but I do not see any Jordanian leadership, whether it's the present monarchical leadership or some other leadership in the future, we don't know. I don't see any leadership in Jordan going beyond some of the moves and maneuvers made by people like the late King Hussein, and even in his own way, a private citizen of tremendous clout, someone like Prince Hassan Talal, who has been trying to develop some sort of understanding. Now, these individuals, they'll play their role, but I don't think you can achieve very much. It's linked to the larger question of the settlements that would be important for the future of Palestine. India, Israel, there's no doubt at all that it has impacted upon the Palestinian struggle to some extent. India and Israel have become much closer because if you look at it historically, India under Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, in the late 40s and right through the 50s and early 60s, was a very staunch supporter of the Palestinian struggle. It changed partly because of other changes that had taken place in India as it moved away from, well, the left, became more accommodative of capitalism and, moved in that direction. I think a change had also taken place, which is very significant, Joe, because you'll find that the reassertion of neoliberal capitalism from the mid-80s onwards has, I think, had an impact upon the Palestinian struggle. More and more countries have moved away from Palestine. And even if they continue to pay lip service to the Palestinian struggle, the larger question of the economy, capitalism, and so on, impacted upon their relations with Israel in particular. So India has been in that sort of situation. India buys a lot of arms from Israel. I think it is the second biggest importer, yes, of arms to India. And even in terms of strategic and intelligence sharing and counter-terrorist moves and maneuvers and so on, I think India and Israel are quite close. They work quite closely together. Yes, it has impacted upon Palestine.
A couple of some questions regarding Yemen, Chandra. The thrust of the question being, aren't the Houthi forces in that particular war at least partly responsible for the horrible, terrible suffering that's been inflicted on the people in Yemen? And as far as Iran is concerned, is it not using Yemen as part of its own self-interested strategy in its struggle against, in its conflict with Israel and the US in particular? Isn't it being used by Iran as a pawn in its wider strategic game?
Yeah. Well, very quickly, Houthi partly responsible, yes, I agree. And if you look at various incidents and so on, I think the Houthis have also been responsible, including some of the political moves that they've made that had led to violence and so on. And about Iran's game, I think it is true that Iran is also involved in Yemen, partly because of its own interests, but it's not so much, I think, US, Iran against US, or Iran against Israel. Israel may be a factor, but not very important. I think it's basically Saudi Arabia, if you ask me. I think it's Iran's concern with Saudi Arabia. And likewise, in the case of Saudi Arabia, their concern, as far as the Yemen conflict is concerned, their concern is Iran. So it is the antagonism between these two actors, Saudi Arabia and Iran, that has shaped the Yemen conflict to some extent, with the US playing a role, of course, especially in terms of arms and intelligence sharing and so on. And of course, Israel has also been involved in the war, for similar reasons. But it is the Saudi-Iran dimension that is most important.
Chandra, moving on to perhaps focusing more sharply on Palestine and what the future holds for Palestinians. What about the large refugee groups located in neighboring countries? In particular, the question asks Lebanon. What do you see as the future and what might be the implications of the deal of the century for them? That's one part. The other part is what about Hamas and Fatah? Do you see any prospect of greater unity between them, a more united front? And thirdly, where does the two-state solution lie now after all that's happened since it was proposed as the solution to the conflict? Is it still a valid, viable option, or do we need to think of other options? Or do the Palestinians need to think of other options?
Yeah. Well, the first question about refugees, the refugee problem, meaning by which Palestinian refugee problem in Lebanon, is a major challenge to any Lebanese government. Years ago, I think Lebanon decided that while looking after the refugees to some extent, they would not grant them citizenship or absorb them into Lebanese society because that would be indirectly helping Israel. And this was the way they looked at it, Why? Because you are in fact easing the problem for Israel. And besides, the refugees have a right to return, and you don't want to weaken the struggle to achieve that right, the right to return. But I can see the refugees benefiting to some extent from some of the economic assistance, if it works out, that they're thinking of doling out to the Palestinians. Though refugees, from what little I know of the actual deal, they have not been mentioned as such in the deal. And I suppose even the others involved in formulating the deal, they would not have thought of the refugees because of the complexities involved. I'm thinking of some of the Arabs involved in forging those deals. They would not have really paid much attention. So they are marginal to this thing, the refugees, unfortunately. Hamas and Fatah and Joe, would they be more united? I don't see that happening immediately. There are two avenues which are worth exploring, and one of them is if there is a genuine, fair, and free election, then you produce a leadership which would have the legitimacy to sort of act as a spokesperson for all the Palestinians. In a sense, in 2006, Hamas, that won the election, actually, as we know, they got more seats than Fatah, both in the West Bank and, of course, in Gaza. Hamas could have played that role, but it was very quickly subverted by various groups, not just Israel, the US, even the European Union, but also, I think, Arab governments. They subverted that role. They did not want Hamas to play that role. So the attitude of these actors towards Hamas will have to change. And Hamas itself also should change to some extent. It must be quite clear about its commitment to the means that it would employ in its struggle. It is clearer today than it was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And I hope Hamas would develop more creative methods of waging a struggle for a just peace without falling back upon some of the methods it's used before. So that would be an important factor too, as far as the Hamas struggle is concerned. But the problem is not Hamas so much as Fatah. Fatah, if you look at the leadership, it is leadership that has been there for a long while, very undemocratic. If I may say this, a leadership which doesn't really reflect the will of the people. Hamas is closer to the people, if you look at Gaza, and even within the West Bank, than Fatah. So you need a different sort of leadership in Fatah, and I hope that if there is a sort of unified election process, different leaders will emerge. What should not be. If the Fatah, in the end, produces leaders who are basically Machiavellian, and they are sort of playing ball with Israel at the same time, like, Dahlan, who has been a major factor in the background as far as the deal of the century is concerned. So that, I think, is the danger, people like that. Hamas is more resolute, it's clearer in its commitment. This is why I'm hoping that elections would perhaps help to lessen this dichotomy in some way between Hamas and Fatah. If there is a genuine, free and fair election, like the last one, which the Carter Center in the United States, they described the 2000 elections as one of the fairest elections that they had evaluated. It was a very fair election. So I think that is something that they should work towards. And if it's a new generation of leaders, the second point I wanted to make, on both sides, Hamas and Fatah, and especially Fatah, new generation, meaning by which people who don't carry the baggage of the past, then I think it'll be easier for them to work together. Sometimes it's because of the baggage that it's difficult for them to work together.
I understand. Chandra, we soon will be running out of time, but I do want to put to you, excuse me, two sets of questions. First has to do with Israel's role, and the second, the US role, not unimportant. Israel, if we can just take that and perhaps we'll just do it as succinctly as we can so as to fit both of them in. Israel, do you see any prospect in the time ahead when Israel might become more receptive to UN resolutions, international law, and calls for conflict resolution? That's one broad question. Two, what do you make of Israel's claim that Palestine is for the Jewish people the promised land, and therefore theologically, if you like to put it that way, a non-negotiable objective? And side by side with that, another question says, what of the argument that Israel cannot claim the land to have been promised and given to them by God, given that they have used violence in order to acquire it? They're two curly questions for you.
Yeah. Well, I overlooked the question about the two-state solution just now, which is part of the earlier set of questions, Joe, and I think I'll try to respond to that in the course of answering some of these questions. Well, maybe I should begin with the two-state solution, inverted commas. I don't see it as a solution. I never really saw it as a solution, even in the past. One got the impression, and this is what a lot of Palestinians are saying, and other champions of the Palestinian cause, that it was all a game, the two-state solution. A game that Israel had invented with the help of the United States, and they continue to play that game, two-state solution, giving the impression that they're working towards peace, when actually they were not serious about it at all. Even if you look at the Oslo Accord, were they serious about a two-state solution when, number one, there were no boundaries defined in that Oslo Accord, which has been the criticism of a lot of people who had criticized the Oslo Accords at that time, including the late Edward Said. No boundaries, nothing, yeah? And yet people saw that as a solution. And as we know, in reality, even under Yitzhak Rabin, who showed some courage in certain areas, but nonetheless, he continued to expand settlements. Yeah? Settlements continued to expand. So were they sincere about a two-state solution when they were going on gobbling up land through the expansion of settlements and so on? So I don't think there was any sincerity, any real commitment to a two-state solution because of the attitude towards settlements, and the whole question of boundaries and, things like that. So two-state solution, I think, was a non-solution right from the outset. So what's the solution? And that I think was also part of the question. I had, when I first became very concerned about the question of Israel and the whole question of the challenge of war in West Asia and so on, I'd always believed that the real solution is a single confederation of Jews and Muslims and Christians. Of course, you need safeguards in terms of protecting, their respective rights, identity, and all the rest of it. but within a single confederation, as it were. In other words, you don't have to divide up that small piece of land. A single confederation which would be faithful to a certain identity that existed in historical times, to the people who lived in what we call Palestine, and who are part of Jerusalem. And if you look at the city of Jerusalem historically and so on, I think it was one of the great multi-religious cities in history. So that is something that one could work towards. I don't think one should give it up completely. It seems very, very tough at this moment, but that may be the only solution in the long run, because I can't see how a two-state solution is going to work, and especially if you look at what's happening on the West Bank. What will constitute the other state, the Palestinian state? There's hardly anything left in terms of, fertile land, in terms of, water resources, I don't think it's going to work at all. And that brings me to the question of Israel. I think this idea that it's a promised land. Our friend Joe, Prof. Ilan Pape, he has a very interesting take on this. So it's just amazing. He wrote somewhere that the Zionists, the majority of the Zionists, is that they don't believe in God, but they believe in God's promise as far as the state of Israel is concerned, which he finds very odd. You see, because if you don't believe in God, how can you believe that God promised you this holy land, So this thing about God promising a piece of land, to me, it diminishes the notion of God. It diminishes the concept of divinity and of transcendent spirituality. I don't think we should treat God as a real estate agent, that he promised land, that this was the bargain and so on. I don't buy that, We know that there's one issue where progressive Christian Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians, and even Jews, they don't subscribe to this. They don't subscribe to this idea. You don't have to be an atheist, but, progressive in the sense that they believe that, it just doesn't make sense to use that sort of argument, And of course, there's the argument about violence, which was part of that question, Joe, that since you've used violence, and this is actually the argument put forward by some religious elements within the Jewish population, the Neturei Karta, for instance, and groups of that sort. Neturei Karta and others, they say, that violence means that you have abdicated your sacred role as far as that land is concerned, by sort of resorting to violence or the rest of it. So I don't think this helps at all, that sort of notion of what Israel is, and the way in which the idea of the state is seen and so on. And if I may add at this point, Joe, I think I'm also one of those individuals who's very much opposed to Muslims sort of clothing the entire argument about Palestine in theological terms, which some of them do. They say, oh, it's because, this is where, certain aspects of the prophet's spiritual life, it's linked to Jerusalem and so on. For that reason, one should, sort of see Jerusalem as Muslim, and, these are individuals, if I may say this, subscribe to the idea of a multi-religious Jerusalem. They want to see it as Islamic, something that they should have total control of, and they argue on the basis of, from 638 AD onwards, of course, there'd been Muslim rule for a long while, And for that reason, they say Muslim rule historically justifies their sort of a notion. It doesn't, because that Muslim rule, if you look at it objectively, it was a rule which was not perpetuated in religious terms. It was basically a city that was open to everyone. It was completely sort of inclusive rather than exclusive. So I think it is that inclusive model that we should be talking about, and that we should be pursuing. And
Chandra, if I may, I'd like to, there were so many questions, we can't deal with all of them, but I wouldn't like us to finish before I put two not unrelated questions, if I may. And perhaps you can weave anything more that you had to say when answering that, because they're broad ranging. One, do you see any prospect of the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States diverging somewhat in the years to come? And might a post-Trump America be able to move in that direction, where the interests begin to diverge? And related to that, to bring it home, what might the Palestinian diaspora and Palestinian support groups around the world, in the Western world as well, be able to do to weaken, if you like, the strategic links that have connected the United States and Israel, particularly during the Trump, no, not just during, but particularly during the Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, the second question is part of the second question is related to the first, about US Israel, links. And so I'll try to handle that first, if I may, Joe. The strategic links that are developed under Trump, of course, the most significant is the question of Jerusalem. Recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving in the direction, something which his predecessors had not done. And of course, he also, though not related to Palestine directly, he had also recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. This is in relation to Syria. And if you look at his general perspective, Trump's, on the Palestinian thing, I think he is the president, from what I can remember, of all the presidents who had spoken on Israel-Palestine relations. He's the one who has taken the most extreme position. I may be wrong, but I can't think of anyone else who had taken such an extreme position, meaning by which not even recognizing the position of Palestinian Muslims and Christians in terms of the history of the land and its evolution and all the rest of it. Of course, his constituency includes the Christian Zionists, but that is different. It is not the sort of thing which Christians in Palestine would be happy about, because they have a different perspective on this whole issue from that of the Christian Zionists. So I think Trump has been bad news as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned. And one could argue, Joe, that when Joe Biden becomes president, or if he becomes president, or when he becomes president, things would change to some extent. Some aspects of this would change. There may be an attempt to sort of be a little less bigoted on this issue, a little less bigoted, a little more, sort of accommodative, and perhaps able to see certain aspects of the Palestinian position and all the rest of it. I think one of the things one should say about Obama and Biden served him as his vice president. One of the things one has to say about Obama is he was, towards the end of his presidency, much more cognizant of the larger landscape than others, which is one of the reasons why he pushed very hard for the nuclear deal, because he saw things were changing, and he could not be seen as tying himself completely to the Saudis, for instance, or to the sort of Netanyahu type of position. And of course, his relations with Netanyahu were not good at all, because he was a little more critical of Netanyahu. Now, if Joe Biden can even achieve a bit of that, it would be a change compared to
the right direction.
That's right, yes. So divergence of that sort, and which is the first question, Joe, I think it is possible. It may, take place, especially if it is supported by the sort of growing consciousness amongst segments of American society that Berkeley had taken a vote, about the question of BDS and what had happened at Harvard, other places. Of course, these are very small constituencies, but nonetheless, I think they're important because they represent, students, they represent major centers of, Israeli power in the past, that these things have begun to change. I think it is very significant, if you see from that point of view. So I feel that in a democracy, for all its weaknesses, and in spite of someone like Donald Trump, I think there is hope. There are sort of glimmers of hope here and there that one should work towards. And for those of us who are in a struggle, we should never give up hope. That I think is very, very important. We should never give up hope. Even little glimmers here and there, they matter a great deal. And the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this whole issue is one of those issues where we have to be hopeful. And we have to go on trying. And, if you look at some of the changes that have taken place, and I used to point out to the way international institutions have become more accommodative of Palestine. Even its non-member status and things of that sort. I think those are signs that are worth looking.
Worth pushing on with.
That's right. Things are changing. And so I remain hopeful, remain optimistic. Yeah.
Well, maybe we could bring this question time to an end with that hopeful sign of what might be possible along the way in the years ahead, and we keep at it in the meantime.
Yes.
Chandra, before I thank you for your presentation and conversation with us this afternoon, it's late morning or lunchtime for you, I just want to make a couple of announcements for Pax Christi, if I may. And the first one has to do with a project that the next slide, yes, that's it. Pax Christi has played a very important role in a project which came under the name Earth at Peace Project. We had a major conference last year, some other activities, and a book has come out of this conference, and I happen to be one of the two editors of the book, Towards a Just and Ecologically Sustainable Peace. And we're going to launching the book, not this coming Tuesday, but Tuesday week, and we'll have Professor Richard Falk and Dr. Vandana Shiva launching the book. Many of the authors will be attending and saying a few words as well. And it should be a very interesting presentation of the ideas in the book, and hopefully ways in which we might build upon them. And they're not irrelevant, of course, to the situation in Palestine, a just and ecologically sustainable peace, what it means and how to get there. So if anyone is at all able, and you're able to register for the event, 27th of October, we'll send you more details. and it's a 6 p.m. Australian time, and then people in other time zones around the world are able to register also if they can. And if not, you will be given access to a recording sometime after the event. The next event I want to mention to you is the next resource I want to mention to you is Disarming Times. It's the journal of Pax Christi nationally, and it's produced and edited by Harry Kerr, whom we heard from right at the beginning. Anyone is able to subscribe to it. You don't have to be a member of Pax Christi. You can be a friend of Pax Christi, and of course, the journal quarterly, every 3 months, would be made available to you. The next thing that I should mention is that we're going to have, this is not, we're going to have Pax Christi's Victoria's annual general meeting in a month or so. You'll be sent more details, but I wanted to alert you to it, that it'll be around the theme of militarism in our part of the world, very much Australia included, and what Australia's choices might be as we look at the prospect of an increasingly militarized region. So you'll be able to find details on the website and the Facebook page of Pax Christi, but in any case, we will make sure to make those details available to you and ways of registering, because everything still has to be done virtually. We're not yet to the stage of having a physical meeting. And by the way, Chandra, we'd love to have some just people joining us for this discussion on militarism in the region and how to respond to it. So that's that. And the final thing I wanted to mention, I think it's a new initiative, and not directly related to Pax Christi, but members, myself included, are playing an important part. This is an attempt to raise the level of conversation in Australia. Recently formed initiative, Conversation at the Crossroads. And we're launching the initiative one full day after the US elections on November the 5th. Australia and the world after Trump. And we'll have Professor Mary Kaldor from the London School of Economics joining us for a presentation, and the former Foreign Minister of Australia, Bob Carr, also. And thirdly, we'll make a live cross to the national correspondent of the Nation, John Nichols, who's also a best-selling author, to share the immediate mood in the United States with us, something of the immediate post-election mood in the United States, and what might that augur for the future. And then we can talk about Australian and implications for Australia and the world. Again, you'll be able to see more on the website, Crossroads Conversation, but also we can send you details should you be interested. Well, let me now close the forum. You have been stalwarts, those of you who've attended, but I think we've had a most wonderful afternoon. The issues and the suffering and the injustice and all the complicated geopolitics are not necessarily uplifting, but I think Dr. Chandra has managed to clarify, to elucidate, to inspire, and maybe even to empower for some further initiatives, further awareness raising in the time to come, and hopefully Pax Christi can play its small part. We are all deeply thankful to you, Chandra, and we hope the association will continue, not just to our mutual advantage, but to the advantage of the quest for a just peace in Palestine and elsewhere. We thank you profusely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to all the participants and everyone else who's helped. And we will meet again in the not too distant future. So I'm just bidding farewell to everyone and thank you for being patient. Hopefully we took up a number of your questions. More on another occasion. Thank you again, Chandra, and thank you to everyone else.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Thank you.
All the best.
Thanks.